Hello, I'm Henry, and I read a book. I read this book, No Country for Old Men by Cormac McCarthy, and I would like to talk about it, please. Now, my t-shirt is about to change, and probably some of the lighting, because I did this intro originally, and I called Cormac McCarthy Robert McCormack. I don't know who Robert McCormack is. I googled him. There's like an actor, but he's not been in anything I've seen, and there's no one I know called Robert McCormack, so I don't know why I did that. If I slip up again and call him that throughout this video, then I'm sorry. To use a trite as balls metaphor, a story's like a boat on a river. The flow of the water is the flow of the plot pushing us along. The boat is the person the boat is the main character. The person in the boat is the person reading because they're inside the main. Is that right? Doesn't matter. The point is the keel. Punctuation is the keel. It makes sure that by the time we get to where we're going, we aren't upside down and drowning. Or does it? Cormac McCarthy thinks otherwise. Cormac McCarthy was an American author born in Rhode Island in 1933 who sadly passed away last month at the age of 89, a great innings. His prolific career is notable for a whole bunch of things, really. His popularization of the neo-Western, his brutally raw themes of life and death, his borderline prophetic tones of nihilism and pessimism, a bleakness that just seems more and more justified as the years go on, especially when his bleakness tended to hone in on authority figures and law enforcement. There was that time he maybe tried to stealthily reintroduce wild wolves to Arizona, which is hilarious and terrifying. He spoke fluent Spanish and used a typewriter well into the 2010s. He was a real one, and the fact that he lived through most of last century and there isn't a controversies section on his Wikipedia page probably means he was an alright bloke. Stephen King called him maybe the finest American author of my time, which, as praise goes, doesn't get much higher. What I'd like to focus on here is his famous use, or lack thereof, of punctuation. By his own admission, Cormac McCarthy tried to limit his punctuation use to capital letters, full stops, the odd comma, and the odd colon for like lists and stuff. Now, most average readers probably won't even notice these self-imposed limitations, except maybe where "and" is used in place of a comma. Side note, I really like that, chucking in conjunctives to make things slower and more epic. There's a word for it that I cannot pronounce, which we will talk about later. What average readers will notice is the lack of quotation marks to denote dialogue. Because he didn't want to, and I quote, irony, blot up the page with weird little marks, he didn't use them. Though I think it's because he didn't know if this style of quotation marks or this style of quotation marks was the correct one, so he just did neither. So the point of this video is to discuss whether this shunning of convention is a good thing that other writers should emulate, or just a weird, stubborn gimmick. Before I do that though, I just want to clarify exactly what punctuation we're looking for and exactly what's missing. I know I just mentioned what Cormac McCarthy himself said he limited himself to, but what's actually on the page is slightly different. At least in this copy of No Country for Old Men. Maybe there are other printings out there with absolutely no formatting whatsoever, and the whole thing is just one single unbroken paragraph about a tired policeman and a guy with a captive bolt gun. In this version of No Country for Old Men, Cormac McCarthy uses capital letters. You can't really go without them unless you want your writing to look like a WhatsApp message typed with one hand while you're getting on the bus. Full stops. Again, can't really go without them, or the book would just go on forever. Commas. A lot more than the odd or occasional comma, I should say. Colons, which he uses in an odd way. Look, after a while he said, I got a report from Austin, and after a while Talbot said, this whole thing is just hell in spectacles, ain't it, Sheriff? It's not really introducing a list like colons are normally used for, but I suppose this is alright. I mean, who am I to argue? I think this use has something to do with the lack of quotation marks, which we will get to in a bit. He uses apostrophes too. Didn't mention that, did you, Mr. McCormack? Well, maybe you did. I didn't have the time to watch every interview you did or the money to read every single book about you. He uses apostrophes to denote ownership, like here with deputies. He also uses them in contractions. except when he doesn't. Real quick, a contraction is where you slam two words together, take out some letters, and stick an apostrophe where those letters were. Like you will, becoming you'll. Simple. So here we've got I'd, it's, he's, and they'll with their correct apostrophe placement, but we've also got wasn't, don't, won't, and ain't with their apostrophes missing. This is all on one page as well. It's a bit weird. Sticking with this page, there are also apostrophes missing where the last letter of a word is dropped, like here with nothing and here with willin'. You maybe should stick an apostrophe at the end of each one, but I suppose it's just showing the vocal inflection of the narration, so it's probably fine. He uses question marks as well, because trying to get a question across without them would be incredibly difficult. Everything would just sound rhetorical and all your characters would come across as rude idiots. I couldn't see any exclamation marks, though that might be because everyone in this book is too sad and tired and grizzled to shout for any reason. I didn't see any semicolons either, which may be because in Cormac McCarthy's own words, he calls them idiocy. I'd love to get to that level of rockstar where you could just call out an entire grammatical device. But man did drop a couple of M dashes, which are up there with the semicolon in the fancy boy punctuation club. The point is, despite his reputation as a trend-bucking maverick, he does actually use quite a lot of standard punctuation, except quotation marks. And like I said a moment ago, this is something he openly talks about, but having read this book, I can now confirm he does in fact not use quotation marks. So maybe the title of this video shouldn't be punctuation optional this whole time, and maybe should be something like quotation marks, do we need them? To answer that, let's look at the pros and cons of taking them out, as well as some of the other punctuation too. The biggest pro in my eyes is this book flipping flies, especially in the dialogue scenes where people are just talking to each other. It absolutely blazes by. I am not a fast reader, but I finished this book in a few days. It's like the TikTok of literary mechanics, and how this isn't industry standard kind of blows my mind a little bit. People shouting at clouds and complaining about kids with their 3-second attention span. Give a 13-year-old a book with just dialogue and minimal dialogue tags, and you just reintroduced reading to the masses. It's magic. Though maybe don't give a 13-year-old this book. In particular, there's a lot of murder and people getting shot in it. But somehow, in almost impossible contrast to that, it also conveys a tone and a feel. A slow tone and a slow feel. It's weird, it shouldn't make sense, but this book does it somehow. It gets in you, in your head, and sort of warps your perception of time. This is mainly due to the prose and the way the characters talk, which feels like William Money from Unforgiven reading you your own eulogy. But it is also because of the punctuation. That polysynthetic use of and I mentioned earlier, hey, I said the word, is a big part of that. Remove commas, add ands, and everything has a slow, heavy gravitas. An example, he eased himself down on the wooden bench and pulled on the socks and opened the package of shorts and took them out and pulled them over his feet and up to his knees and then stood and pulled them carefully over his dressing. So that was a man just putting on some underwear, and it sounded like something out of the Bible. The lack of quotation marks has a slightly different effect to all the ands, but it still adds to the tone. It's difficult to describe, even with an example. It's kind of soupy. All the dialogue sort of mixes together. No, maybe that's not quite right. Each line sort of runs into the next one without the little marks acting as psychological separators. And it results in this thick stream of Texas goo. It's delicious, like a long sip of bourbon on a... And I think this removal of punctuation to nail a grim tone will work across any genre, not just Western/neo-Western. You could probably try it in any story that just makes you glad you aren't any of the characters in it. And as an additional tiddly little minor positive to end on here, it's just quite visually pleasing to have a lot less stuff on a page. It just looks crisp. And that minimalist aesthetic is actually quite thematically appropriate here. I mean, it's bare bones, like bones picked clean by a cow. Okay, and that's all the good stuff. Let's get on to the less than good stuff. The biggest con of all this playing with punctuation is it can get a bit confusing. I mean, people invented quotation marks for a reason. They naturally make things easier to read, especially if your brain has been programmed to expect to see them since you were a toddler. They separate things that need to be separated. Dialogue and narration are two separate things. Therefore, we have these little dots to signify that separation. So when they aren't there, your brain sort of short circuits. It's most notable in this book when there's a long back and forth between characters, especially when there's more than two in the conversation. It can get a little hard to follow. There are also minimal dialogue tags like John said or whispered Jane. So I did find myself a few times being like, who's this talking now? Is it the sheriff? Probably the sheriff. It's the sheriff. This could be so much worse. It could be an absolute casserole. It could be completely illegible, but it isn't. For one main reason. Cormac McCarthy has some serious skills. I know, shocker. He's very careful with the way he eases into dialogue scenes, often establishing who's in any given space before they all start talking. And he doesn't go full sicko mode. He does use a new line for each new speaker, and that does help. That being said, have a look at this. In this scene, the sheriff, Bell, and his partner, Wendell, are meeting with another policeman called Torbert about a dead body. This is the exact punctuation and formatting. Torbert opened the truck, and they stood looking at the body. The front of the man's shirt was covered in blood, partly dried. His whole face was bloody. Bell reached into the trunk and took something from the man's shirt pocket and unfolded it. It was a blood-stained receipt for gas from a service station in Junction, Texas. Well, he said, this was the end of the road for Bill Wyrick. Wyrick? Wyrick? I didn't look to see if he had a billfold on him. That's alright, he don't. This here was just dumb luck. He studied the hole in the man's forehead. Looks like a 45, clean. Almost like a wad cutter. What's a wad cutter? It's a target round. You got the keys? Yes, sir. Bell shut the trunk lid. He looked around. Passing trucks on the interstate were downshifting as they approached. I've already talked to Lamar. Told him he can have his unit back in about 3 days. I called Austin, and they're looking for you first thing in the morning. I ain't loading him into one of our units, and he damn sure don't need a helicopter. You take Lamar's unit back to Serona when you get done, and call me or Wendell, and we'll come and get you. Got any money? Yes, sir. Fill out the report same as any report. Yes, sir. White male, late 30s, medium build. How'd you spell Wyrick? You don't spell it. We don't know what his name is. Yes, sir. He might have a family someplace. Yes, sir. Sheriff? Yes? What do we have on the perpetrator? We don't. Give Wendell your keys before you forget about it. They're in the unit. Well, let's not be leaving keys in the units. Yes, sir. I'll see you in 2 days' time. Yes, sir. Hope that son of a bitch is in California. Yes, sir. I know what you mean. I got a feeling he ain't. Yes, sir. I do too. Wendell, you ready? Wendell leaned and spat. Yes, sir. He said, I'm ready. Okay. So my question to you is, how many times did Wendell speak in that exchange? It isn't until the very end. I'm 90% sure on that. But technically, based on the normal rules of writing, and because there are no dialogue tags, he could be speaking any of these red lines, though this isn't taking context into account. So if we take context into account, he could still be speaking any of these orange lines. Real quick, I'm assuming here that Wendell outranks Torbert, so Torbert calling him sir would make sense. And because of ingrained standard writing conventions, your brain sort of subconsciously thinks these things about these places where different people could be speaking, and it almost trips itself up, and you find yourself a little lost without really realizing it. Again, this could be so much worse, and these long exchanges between 3 or more people are quite rare, so it's not a significantly recurring issue. I just feel like it is an issue. It really is the only issue though, at least for me. I suppose if you're an English lit traditionalist, the fact that Cormac McCarthy got published in the first place probably gives you sleepless nights. So after all the pros and the singular big con, is binning punctuation something other writers should do? I think yes, with a but. I think if you've got the skills to pull it off, skills like Cormac McCarthy, who, remember, Stephen King called the finest American author of his time, and I think if you've got a very clear idea of the tone, and that tone is appropriate, i.e. you can't be writing a middle grade adventure about 3 kids following the fun fair around the country and have it sound like Arthur Morgan wishing he was dead. I think, yeah, give it a shot. Back in the original t-shirt, thanks a lot for watching the video to the very end. Please like and subscribe and all that good stuff. Next one is going to be another bit of a genre change, but still one that's quite interesting as well. Plus I'm going to start doing some more shorts content revolving around the things over my left shoulder here. So look out for those.